the top of the topic of our class, nonfiction prose, um, seems like a fairly obvious topic, in a way less technical, less complex to understand than fiction. Fiction, after all, is art. It seems less refined or complicated as a practice, nonfiction, just documenting what happens. Um, but in fact, it's a more novel. It's a newer kind of writing than fiction. Um, the bulk of writing that's been done in history has been sacred writing. Um, and nonfiction writing, the idea of that it's important to just document what happens in a for the sake of documenting reality, objective reality. I think that's a pretty new appearance historically. I think that's a legacy of the Enlightenment, the modern Enlightenment. The notion of history as a quasi-objective science, that there are objective events that are worth studying and understanding in a more or less scientific way. And the same is true of individual lives. That so the genre of nonfiction exists because people believe that is a thing, like a project that's valid, legitimate thing to do. But it's correlated, I think, with what we with the secularization of culture, the loss of authority and centrality of religion, and which is to say, all we have left to unite us is a sense of shared participation in history. Just the events that happen. So with secular modernization, it becomes less and less clear why, what are shared, what binds us culturally. Less and less is sacred, as they say. And more is categorizable as random and insignificant accident, rather than an expression of some larger cosmic plan or transcendent purpose of history. Franz Kafka writes this little parable about, I read it as about this loss of transcendent purpose. And I would like you to think about how the difference between children and adults, that difference in learning styles and forms of knowledge, the difference, remember, between exploration and exploitation, experimental learning of children, and the confirmation bias that characterizes adult learning. Adults know what they want, know what they know, and want to keep it, sort of exploiting that knowledge. Because it's powerful in the world, whereas children want to explore and experiment. And instead of a confirmation bias, have rather, Alison Gopnik argues, a falsification bias. They're more curious in what disrupts contradicts what they understand rather than what confirms what they understand. So I think this is kind of interesting. This parable is, on the one hand, about the loss of royalty. I want you to think also about, what I was saying earlier about the role of royalty in popular culture. Celebrities are kind of like a replacement royalty, that it assumes a stark political dimension and critical insight into social inequalities and lyrics like Kendrick Lamar's. And this parable also, though, is about children, the difference between children and adults. And it's about the law, what Kendrick Lamar is also addressing. These are all interwoven. And media, couriers, how the communication, transfer of information. All these issues that I've been trying to bring up and address in this class in one way or another. So I find this really, really powerful little parable. Couriers. They were given the choice between becoming kings or the couriers of kings. In the manner of children, they all wanted to be couriers. As a result, there are only couriers. They gallop through the world shouting to each other messages that, since there are no kings, have become meaningless. Gladly would they put an end to their miserable existence, but they dare not because of their oaths of service. There's, Kafka's amazing writer. He is able to pack so much. He's very well versed in biblical writing, like Kierkegaard, who Zadie Smith draws on in the essay for this week, Attunement. She takes the whole motif of attunement from Kierkegaard's book on the story of Abraham and Isaac from the Old Testament. So questions I would like you to consider here. So it seems, as I mentioned, to be a story about, the loss of the sacred, loss of enchantment, which I've been discussing. It is about the replacement of the enchantment, the loss of royalty, and the replacement of that by a kind of disenchanted oath of service, the law, a mechanical compulsion, imperative that we dare not betray, but that it gives no purpose or meaning, have become meaningless. And it leaves only a miserable existence. So that's clear enough. What I guess questions I'd like you to consider are this question of the manner of children. Why is it childlike to prefer to be a courier? There's a sense, I get a little bit of a accusatory tone in the parable, as if it's the children's fault. In the manner of children, as a result, it's because of their childishness that we've wound up with only couriers. They didn't see ahead that some people needed to be kings. That seems like kind of a implication of the parable. But what is childlike, we might ask, about choosing miserable obedience to the law. That seems unchildlike. That I think is a very dubious sentence there. In the manner of children, they all wanted to be curious. I mean, that sentence is disguising deception. The children were deceived. They thought that in the manner of children, what actually would be childlike about the preference to be a courier? I think that it has to do with what Alison Gopnik talks about as exploration. They want to mediate, communicate, travel. They want a king to serve. It's boring to be the king, but to be the king's servant, to have a royal mandate, to be a knight, to uphold a royal purpose. That seems to me like a childlike priority, why they might choose to be couriers. So that's to say that they believed in the existence of kings. Those being questioned then were deceived by the questioner. The question implies that being a king is an option. Was a reality in the world. I mean, to be the courier of the king presupposes that kings are real. So there's something dubious about the way in which the narrator turns around and blames the children for the lack of kings. So if it's their fault that kings are gone, but the question presupposes that there are kings to serve. Otherwise being couriers of kings would be meaningless. Remember, I think in the very first lecture of this course, I talked to you about this issue, by asking, hypothetically, for you to explain yourself, explain what you're doing, explain, on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month, year-to-year. You can say, what are your projects? And you can make logical explanations for what you're doing, why you're in school to get a job, you want to have a family. You can give logical explanations. You can account for yourself rationally and objectively in those instrumental terms, up to a certain point. But sooner or later you run up against this question, like, what are you? Like, who are you? What are you for? What is the larger picture of your life, your story of your life, the purpose of your you? At a certain point, you have to say not just why I'm doing what everybody else would do in my situation, as if it isn't a question. There's no individual preference or expression at play. At some point, you're going to have to say, I'm making this choice because it's just about me, about who I am. And I think what I'm saying is that we live in an individualistic culture, and I think that's part of the interest of autobiography and nonfiction writing. Is it's exploring individual lives, individual experiences, what it means to have live this kind of life that we live. And it's part of modernity. It's part of consumerism. I think our investment in individuality is greater, much more intense than it was in pre-modern times, where it was sufficient to repeat the role of your ancestors. There were traditional social roles, and you drew your identity from those rather than from your individual, self. So I did what my father did, and that more generic in a way, social identity or vocation really got to the foundation of, as well as like family roles. But now, I think it's a new development in our culture, and you can see how it's related to consumerism. So much of the concern for defining ourselves, that leads to a lot of consumption, right? Like that, and productivity. Like we're so busy producing, and it's about this project of being ourselves, of just discovering and creating who we are. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote about the difference between hot cultures, in other words, modern, rationalistic, utilitarian cultures, individualistic, and cold traditional cultures. So a cold culture is the type I was just describing, that was focused primarily on repeating traditional identities and social routines and institutions. So my identity would be exhausted by my fulfillment of a social role, a role in a story, son, husband, I don't know. So, very, very intricate. It's not as if, the point is that we can't really, understand it. We've forgotten what this kind of royalty even means, what it feels like. Kafka's, this is a parable about the modern world, running around without that transcendent sense of the sacred. That there's some bigger participation in some tradition that is bigger than us. Now we just have us, or just our own individuality, and that's what Lévi-Strauss meant by hot culture. We draw these distinctions, like dates. We keep track of how old we are, and when I was born, and that's different from when my dad was born, and we're drawing all these distinctions, marking out our individuality, distinguishing ourselves from everyone around us. And that's, again, I think characteristic of our society, hugely productive and active, the investment we have in carving out and creating our individuality. And that's, I think, what Kafka's getting at. They gallop through the world shouting to each other, this kind of hyperactivity, but increasingly disenchanted. So what I think's interesting about this parable, or what I think this parable is doing in a way, is exposing a kind of adult ideology that's forgotten what kings even are. This is the parable. The function of the parable is to explain why the world has lost kings, and it's blaming it on the children. I mean, and I think there's something typical about this. Adults are always complaining about the children, how they're messing things up, and have forgotten to respect the old values in some way or another. But I think this parable points out how it's the adults that have betrayed their own premise here. We gave them the choice to be kings or couriers of kings, and they all chose couriers, but that's because they wanted to serve kings. And so I think this parable is told from a perspective that's already miserable, it's trying to explain its misery. It lives in a world of nothing but misery. And what's lost is not only royalty, but childhood. So it's blaming the children in a resentful, in the resentful way, I think, of adults. In the manner of children, they chose to be couriers. There's, I think, a tone of blame there, but there's also a tone, I think, now from this perspective, I'm suggesting even jealousy. Like we resent them because they still had faith in kings. They hadn't yet fallen into our misery. Of meaningless galloping around and shouting. So this is a long-winded introduction about this modernity and the loss of the sacred, and how that overlaps with the developmental story of adults and children that Alison Gopnik describes, and I'll be going into more detail about that. So this all comes back to Zadie Smith's essay, Attunement, and the correlation she draws between popular culture, taste in popular culture, and the sacred, or religion. It both involve a kind of leap of faith, or the possibility of a leap of faith. There is what I was talking about in terms of personal identity. Like we need to choose, we have to make a kind of leap of faith and deciding, what my ultimate purpose is as an individual, besides just, self, profit maximization, in some impersonal metric of self-justification. Well, you could say, that's kind of an outlandish comparison or analogy. Pop music, like pop cultural preferences, and religious faith, the Abrahamic faith in God, that's, a willingness to sacrifice one's son. But her response to this is, the aesthetic is, it's not a monumental institution. Aesthetic taste is a minor institution. But I think another, what we're looking at is decreasing the misery, mitigating the misery of this miserable existence described by Kafka. So it's about opening the door a crack for an experience of the sacred. Remember, in the essay, she talks about going to visit Tintern Abbey, a ruin of a cathedral, a beautiful ruin of a cathedral. Here's a picture of Tintern Abbey. This is a kind of icon of romantic poetry because William Wordsworth wrote one of his most famous poems about visiting it. And ruins generally are a piece of fascination for romantics, and it's not especially romantic. Ruins are tourist attractions in general, and this is a tourist attraction. So this is a romantic icon of modern society in general. And that's a point Zadie Smith makes. She characterizes herself self-deprecatingly. It's kind of in sort of Philistine terms. In the article in general, she emphasizes her lack of taste and resistance to Joni Mitchell. There are interesting class and racial components in that she explores underlying that resistance. But she also characterizes herself as kind of a Philistine, or just kind of not particularly culturally sophisticated in her preference to, or eagerness to get down the road to a fast food place to get something to eat, rather than stopping at this kind of site of romantic pilgrimage. That but she observes that this it's an iconic romantic site because of the poem written about it, and that it's an old poem. It was written 200 years ago, but she makes the point that 200 years ago this was already a ruin. This is much older than 200 years. It represents a time of a different scale than 200 years. It's been around for like millennia. It's more on a millennial time scale. And she also says that the life that it represents, of religious devotion and concentration, is likewise foreign and distant in the past, way more distant to Wordsworth writing his poem than Wordsworth is to us now. Here's how Zadie Smith puts it. That form of holy concentration, the form of life devoted to the sacred, of a monk that would have inhabited this abbey. That form of holy concentration has now been gone longer than it was ever here. It left this relic of a kind of devotion to time. It's a artifact of a certain, devotion to the sacred, a certain what it means to be a courier of the king, left such a lasting impact, and that we've preserved it and keep preserve the memory, preserve that artifact as as a memory of what it means to be a courier to a king. So she continues, it was already an ancient memory 200 years ago when Wordsworth came by. Thistles sprout between the stones, the rain comes in, roofless, floorless, glassless, green to the very door. Now Tintern is forced to accept the holiness that is everywhere in everything. So that's what I think, that's the predicament that I was talking about, that we're left to a world, leveled world, where everything is kind of equally accidental and, just facts. If we're going to find sacredness at all, it has to be out in the world in general. And that's sort of what happens to Zadie Smith. She has a kind of religious experience. She that's associated with Tintern Abbey and with sort of learning to love Joni Mitchell. And again, she sort of self-deprecatingly compares it to Kierkegaard, and it's Kierkegaard's this intense existentialist philosopher writing about this biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, and what kind of faith must Abraham have had to be willing to believe in God, so that when God told him to sacrifice the only thing that gave life reason to him, his son, he was willing to do that. And Kierkegaard, as a modern existential thinker, somebody who's trained by Hegel and was acutely aware of Enlightenment philosophy, and had very sophisticated secular education, in history, the development of culture, and which involved, I think, a great deal of sophistication about psychology. And that's what he wants. He wants a psychologically realistic understanding of Abraham. He's like, how could he do that? How does that work? That he really had faith. He really believed and was... Kierkegaard tries to retell the story in a modern way. It's like a novel, like Abraham climbing the mountain to go to the place where he's supposed to sacrifice his son. Like, how did that happen? He writes about it in the book Fear and Trembling. Like, what was that moment of fear and trembling, like fear of the Lord and trembling before sacrificing his son? What was that? How did that work? I think the final he goes through it in amazing detail, but I think his conclusion has to do with the idea of absurdity and the limits of our comprehension, what we can understand. The idea of the leap of faith. I'll just parenthetically tell you a little bit about the details of the argument, because I think it's interesting, and I think it relates to royalty, the question of royalty, and I think that's what I want to suggest Zadie Smith is trying to preserve or retrieve in the terms of Kafka's Parable. So to describe what it means to take a leap of faith, Kafka distinguishes between the night of resignation and the night of faith. That's to say, the night like an adventurer, in service to a king, and like King Arthur. So he's putting it in those in the terms of a romantic tale, a romantic story. A knight serving either the king of resignation or the royalty of resignation, or the royalty of faith. And the difference between these is basically a difference between what you can understand and what is absurd. The Knight of Resignation embodies everything we could ask of a hero. That is somebody who's willing to resign everything for an ideal, for a purpose. But the point is, he has the consolation. The Knight of Resignation has the consolation of understanding his purpose. He knows why. He understands his role in. He has some kind of narrative structure, context for his sacrifice, for his self-sacrifice. But that's what distinguishes the Knight of Faith. Is the Knight of Faith lacks even that consolation. So it lacks that security. The refrain in Fear and Trembling is the Knight of Faith goes further. He isn't just willing to sacrifice everything for what he understands. He's willing to sacrifice also his understanding, and say, I'm serving something bigger than me. It's not for me to comprehend it. That's what it means to be a courier of a king. To believe in something bigger than yourself, and that also means that we can't properly understand royalty. We wouldn't know, or what it even means to serve royalty. We wouldn't know Abraham if he was around us. Because we don't understand. The faith is absurd. We don't understand. It's defined by its resistance of our understanding. So Kierkegaard insists that he could be, whereas the Knight of Resignation is a hero, a recognizable hero in comprehensible terms. The Knight of Faith isn't. And Zadie Smith relates this leap of faith, the absurd leap of faith, to parenthood and childhood. And that's how the childhood enchantment is retrieved, or that's what that investment in the absurd is, what that childhood enchantment means, and just for a second, going back to the McGilchrist, that is, and Alison Gopnik, that is what they emphasize about children, is the predominance of the right brain, this more intuitive, experimental, learning through play, so that learning in ways that lack rational accountability, being curious about falsification, so that's what how Zadie Smith relates it to the generation gap, the difference, the way in which we have to negotiate our own inheritance from our parents. So she quotes the another ancient philosopher. So isn't it interesting? She's relying on all these ancient texts to describe this absurd, on her own terms, switch in her taste in pop music. Um, uh, so that's what I think it means to reverse Kafka's parable, is to find something sacred in unpredictable and unexpected forms, to regain childlike mediation or service of a higher, enchanted purpose. So this means acting and believing in the manner of children, choosing in the manner of children, which is to say, in a way that adults' accountability can't necessarily explain. Being in the moment, responsive to a kind of, unpredictable sense of magic, letting the world happen to you, and take you where it will. And this is evoked by, she loses her sense of time, loses her sense of narrative. Things are confused. The logical order of the senses is kind of deranged, all in terms that are very characteristic of romantic poetry that she proceeds to compare herself to. But the point is that it's what's left for modern people of a kind of religious experience, revelation. So just after she gets done describing what's left, Tintern is forced to accept the holiness that is everywhere in everything. So she defines quite precisely, like, the form in which holiness is available to her. And then what? As I remember it, sudden flooded the area. My husband quoted a line from one of the Lucy poems by Wordsworth. I began humming a strange piece of music. Something had happened to me. I love that confusion of time. Isn't that how childhood memories are? And I think it's evocative of that absorption in the moment that characterizes childhood experience, according to Gopnik and McGilchrist. Responsivity, this to the environment in a way that's proper to this more experimental, exploratory learning style of children, rather than the instrumental, goal-oriented, linear routines of the rather adult attitude. Indeed, Smith's epiphany is very reminiscent of Wordsworth's poem, in that she loses her sense of time. She's just sort of overwhelmed by the sun flooding the area, and the time of music replaces this sort of more dreamy, childlike time that, as I was saying, the way in which we remember childhood. This replaces empirical reality, the objective reality of adults, what seems suggested by this, very objective title, like it's, as if a newspaper byline. It's just, he's saying time and place, date stamp, but when you look at the first few lines of this poem, you'll see he's trying to locate himself in time and place. So it was 5 years ago, and I was right here, and that he's trying to link up the memory with the experience of now. There are all these, he uses these and that, these waters, these steep and lofty cliffs. He's pointing at the objective world around him. And yet, like in Smith's recount, her story of her experience, the scene is flooded, and then something had happened. Like, but she can't tell this, relate the experience in a linear narrative, a linear recounting that where events are objectively arrayed in a linear time sequence, and in the way that's suggested by this date. Again, the hot time, distinguishing precisely each day needs to have its own designation. That's precisely what's getting lost here, just as Zadie Smith loses her sense of time. So just notice how every time he, points at the objective world around him, it kind of, he digresses into vaguer, more dreamy images of the inland murmur, thoughts of more deep seclusion, the quiet of the sky. So just to notice this, this is, basically what I'm saying. This is what it means to retrieve that manner of children, that attitude of children, from the misery of adherence to objectivity, empty objectivity, and rationality. That defines the miserable oaths of service that Kafka describes. 5 years have passed, 5 summers, with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with the soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs, that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees, with some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. So you can see how he develops that dreaminess into a little, fable. He's starting to weave in a very childlike way of the scene of the hermit. He's telling a story here, a little fairy tale, but it's very psychologically realistic. It's very consistent, that is, with the difference that we've been discussing between the child and the adult's mind. Here's an article in the Wall Street Journal by Alison Gopnik that focuses on just this transition on adolescence, the transition between childhood and adulthood, which is, when we, form so many of our tastes, our aesthetic tastes, in our choices in popular music. It's just what she's discussing. And it's this helps make sense of the point about choosing whose children we are, because that is sort of what adolescence boils down to, that it's a period of transitioning from your primary bond being your parents to your primary bond being your peers. So you're choosing who it's an elective affinity. You're choosing a new family, and there's something that it's that transition. It's childlike, but you're responsible for it then later as an adult. So it's just like in Kafka's Parable, you're accountable for this choice that really is about not being objective, but the most kind of subjective choice you can make. Another way of looking at the point that I made about the example I asked you to think about justifying yourself, and how ultimately your story must lack, in order to be meaningful, it has to lack a justification. It has to be just about you, your choice. You are your own reason, rather than needing to account for yourself in terms that apply to everybody else. That would drain your life of its meaning if it was what everybody else should do. You should have your own purpose. So that's why we depend on that childlike ability to judge, a childlike sense of learning and enchantment, and participating in being responsive to a bigger world. And that's what peers can give us. Like peers we can share a sense of devotion to a bigger ideal, fantasy, story. I think that's a big part of what pop music, popular culture is about, identifying oneself through one's dreams. So let's just look. I think it's helpful to look at how she characterizes this difference. Recent studies in the neuroscientist lab at Cornell suggest that adolescents aren't reckless because they underestimate risks, but because they overestimate rewards, enchantment. They believe in enchantment. They overestimate, they overvalue, by adult terms. They find rewards more rewarding than adults do. The reward centers of the adolescent brain are much more active than those of either children or adults. Think about the incomparable intensity of first love, the never-to-be-recaptured glory of the high school basketball championship. When teenagers want most of all are social rewards, especially respect of their peers. In a recent study, teenagers did a simulated high-risk driving test while they were lying in an fMRI. This reward system of their brains lighted up much more when they thought another teenager was watching what they did, and they took more risks. So that the respect of your peers, fulfilling a common standard of value that you and your peers share, and that you and your peers sort of define and negotiate through your own behavior. You define what's worth doing. You try to match, other models. But it's a active and open negotiation of what's play. I guess what I'm saying is it's analogous to play, rather than a utilitarian adult pursuit that where the purposes, the values aren't negotiated. It's about money or success in readily quantifiable terms. This is glory. This is this is about chasing glory in that romantic sense. And she says, from an evolutionary point of view, this makes perfect sense. One of the most distinctive evolutionary features of human beings is our unusually long protected childhood. Human children depend on adults for much longer than those of any other primate. That long protected period also allows us to learn much more than any other animal. But evidently, we have to leave the safe bubble of family life, take what we learned as children and apply it to the adult world. But eventually we have to do that. Becoming an adult means leaving the world of your parents, starting to make your way toward the future that you will share with your peers. Puberty not only turns on the motivational and emotional system with new force, but also turns it away from the family and toward the world of equals. So another way of thinking about this is that, just as you can't justify yourself objectively and be true to your individual identity, I don't think you can justify your friendships or your romantic, intimate relationships objectively. In the end, if you have objective reasons for why you have the friends you do, that's insulting, right? Like you had because they're useful, because they're they're rational friends to have. In a way, like, isn't that, it's kind of obvious. The value of friendship is or romance is correlated with its uselessness or lack of profitability. That's what makes it romantic. But I just think it's important, it's part of the disparagement of romanticism in culture generally, that teenagers, I think, are tend to look down on them, or there is that prejudice against children that I was remarking on in the fable. But this is a value, like an investment in royalty, an investment in serving royalty, of chasing glory, that adults commonly disdain. But I think if you step back for a second and see, well, if you disdain that, then what is left of life? That disdain is predicated on a dogmatic or just sort of a tired naturalization of the purpose of bourgeois life. But that's what Kafka's describing as miserable. That isn't so much of literature about making exactly the same point, like that if you just choose the rat race, it's miserable. I had a teacher who said, studying literature is preventative medicine for midlife crisis. Because it's a message from the adults to the children. In a lot of cases, that's exactly what it is. It's like, your experience of the world is going to change. It's going to get a lot more just instrumental, and the experience of time is going to become less full, less spontaneous and less compelling. It's going to become a lot more boring. I, so the this is the point is to re integrate a kind of childlike experience, attunement, and music is an emblem. Dancing is a crucial way in which that childlike perspective persists in adult life, as McGilchrist talks about in the chapter on language, truth, and music. And I always think it's interesting to think about, what's at stake in music is the loss of control. You're acting spontaneously, you're responding spontaneously, and you don't know why. It's not explicit the way language is, but it communicates a deep sense of who you are. I mean, I really invite you to think about how much of your identity is connected to the experience of music. I'm always struck by how I can't imagine some of the music I love, how hard it is to imagine that music not existing. It's much like it's so hard to imagine your family members or friends not existing. They're integral to who you are. You're woven together with them, to use Rebecca Solnit's analogy of weaving, creating yourself through these acts of weaving in ways that don't fit linear narratives, weaving together different influences, playfully, intuitively, environmentally. That's what it means to be in the moment. That's what it means to exercise that childlike learning style. And that's what Rebecca Solnit indicates in her distinction between, when she's analyzing the Ana Teresa Fernandez painting, the woman represented and the woman representing. The painting is an image of a woman. We see the woman there, but the figure. But it's an image of a painter. It's a trace. It's an artifact of an act of painting. That action is attested to and represented in a powerful way. In the formalism, that's hence it's so much of it is just the play of paint. And so that I think is what Zadie Smith too is describing in the, this moment of the sun flooding the area, just this moment of Zadie Smith describes this moment of sun flooding the scene, losing herself, dissolving in the environment and in the music. She found herself humming a strange piece of music. Something had happened to me. This evaded and transformed somehow by the outside world, by the bigger world. So I think it happens at Tintern Abbey, but she's reflecting on Tintern Abbey. There's a kind of inheritance of not just Wordsworth, but not just Wordsworth's poem about his own experience of memory at Tintern Abbey, but Tintern Abbey itself. Really looking at the scene opens her up. This representation of time, massive time. So it's a responsiveness to the environment, like teaching her. It's kind of an enchanted environment, enchanted with this long time, these different scales of time juxtaposed, as like music is a different kind of time. So, but I think the point is that the clinical objective narration is replaced by this more rhythmic, like musical dissolving in the environment. And it's sort of, I mean, so what she describes is also a weird confusion of time. Something had happened to me. So something happened and I didn't notice, like time, there's like a time warp. As all of a sudden I'm affected by something that I don't know what it is. And yet I know the future. I know that this is a different me somehow, or this, I can predict the future, that I will remember this. So it's a weird, it's a, kind of conversion, rebirth. She makes the point that she's the same age as Jesus, when she has this, experience at Tintern Abbey. And I think that's part of the story here, is that there's something about being 30, like Hamlet's age, that it's that it has to do with adolescence on some level, I think, and the negotiating that length of life, like that I think for a long time most people died by 30. And I think part of the issue, so for a lot of human history, these questions didn't matter. But civilization has to do with living longer and having to negotiate a purpose beyond just getting the reproduction done, so I think that's part of the story, is this the recreation, a kind of second coming, like a second life, a second chapter, is something we've had to invent, which is involves a kind of adolescent weaving of the child's and the adult mind.